Hi guys, this is day 17 of the 42-day AS Economics Revision Challenge, and today we're doing policies to fix market failure. We're looking at three market failures in this discussion. One market failure is public goods. So let me write this. So market failure is public goods. Another one is merit goods. And the last one is demerit goods. In the case of public goods, we say this, that the market failure is the fact that there is no provision of the good. And why is that so? As we discussed earlier, the reason why this happens is because the goods are non-excludable and non-rival. The fact that they are non-excludable means there will be no one willing to pay for those goods, and because no one is willing to pay for those goods, there is no demand, market demand, and the private sector will therefore not be interested in making the good because it's not profitable to do so. So although public goods are important for the society, they're not provided at all. On the other hand, merit goods are what we call under-provisioned. And the reason why they're under-provisioned is because of the market failure of information failure or information asymmetry. So there is information failure and the fact that there is positive externality. Both these contribute to the fact that positive externality. Let me just write that, positive externality. So both these factors contribute to what we call less demand than the socially desirable level. On the other hand, your demerit goods have a case of information failure, but alongside information failure, there is also a problem of negative externality, and these two features contribute to what we call, in the case of demerit goods, we say there is a problem of over-provision. So let's see how government can fix this problem of provisioning. In the case of public goods, since consumers are not willing to pay for the good, the government undertakes provision. So the government undertake provision. How do they do that? Well, they can do that by raising tax revenue and then providing these goods. Sometimes government undertake production themselves, sometimes they ask a firm to provide those goods, but whatever the case is, the government has to undertake provision in this case. So national defense, street lights, your lighthouse, all these examples are those where the government ends up provisioning or providing these goods through the taxpayers' money. In the case of merit goods, we see there is a case of providing this good, but the government has two common sort of ways to provide these goods. Number one, they can give what we call a subsidy. And I'm going to discuss in a little while how subsidy affect the market when it comes to merit goods. Number two, they can also do information dissemination. Information dissemination means that they are spreading information, knowledge, or opinion about the good part of these merit goods. So that's one thing. In the case of demerit goods, what we see government sometimes to do is they can put indirect taxes, and sometimes also they provide the negative sort of aspects of the good. So there is an information dissemination that can also be useful. So let's look at focus on merit and demerit goods, and let's focus on the advantages and disadvantages of indirect taxes and subsidies as a way to fix the problem. But before we move on, I want to talk about one important point, that because there's a information failure that is attached with both merit and demerit goods, by providing information or disseminating information, the government can also help the case. So, for example, in the case of cigarettes, higher higher information about the harms of cigarettes has helped in reducing demand for those goods. Similarly, in the case of these vaccinations like polio drives and other vaccinations, the government's effort to inform parents about the usefulness of these vaccines has resulted in demand to go up. So spreading information is an important tool, is because the problem is two-pronged. There is both information failure and externality. So while externality can be sorted through subsidies, the information failure part require there has to be information dissemination to take place. So first discussion I want to have is basically indirect taxes as a means to fix externality, and then we'll talk about what are the pros and cons of indirect taxes. So let's see how indirect taxes work in the case of demerit goods. Let's assume this is demand and supply of a demerit good. For example, let's say cigarettes, although demand should be more inelastic, but let's say this is demand and supply of cigarettes, and let's say government decides to put an indirect tax. So this demand will be my what we call marginal private benefit, the benefit that the consumers get from buying this good, right? When you put a tax on the good, what you're trying to do is that you would ultimately want the quantity of this good to be demanded to fall. So when we put an indirect tax, the supply curve will shift backward from S to S dash. And the result of the supply curve would be that the quantity that you are buying goes from Q0 to Q1. So there is a reduction in quantity of Q1 to Q1 that happens after you put indirect taxes. Now, if this Q1 is the socially desirable quantity, then you have achieved your target. But if this Q1 is less than socially desirable quantity, then you may need to put a larger tax. So you would want to put an indirect tax, which could result in quantity demanded to fall and the price to rise for the demerit goods. So my new quantity will be Q1 and my new price will be P1. So price is going up, quantity is going down, and the government can achieve the goal of reducing the externality that is caused by the overconsumption of the good. So there will be that overconsumption of the good will no longer happen if we put the right amount of the tax. So let's look at now the advantages and disadvantages of indirect taxes. The first big advantage of indirect tax is that it uses market forces of demand and supply. So what do we mean by market forces of demand and supply? Well, basically, unlike other sort of ways to fix market failure, such as regulations, such as laws, this is much more easier because we just make the good expensive by putting a tax, and the automatic result will be that the price goes up and the consumption will fall. So it uses market forces of demand and supply, and therefore becomes easier. Just by making the good expensive, we are now lowering the quantity of the good to be bought. The second important advantage we see of our indirect taxes is that it's also very easy to administer. So what do we mean by easy to administer? Well, the idea is this, that we make the good expensive and people will buy the less of that good. So One, unlike your direct taxes where there is a possibility of tax evasion, in this case you don't need to worry about tax evasion. You know that as soon as a consumer buys a good, he will have to pay this tax. So there is no evasion possible. You buy the good, you pay the tax. The third one that we want to talk about in terms of advantages will be the fact that the indirect taxes result in government to earn tax revenue, and this is important for the government because this revenue can help them provide other public goods or even sometimes provide merit goods. So the third advantage is government earns tax revenue. Let's now look at the disadvantages of indirect taxes. So the first disadvantage that I want to talk about is the fact that when we're putting indirect taxes, they are regressive in nature. What do we mean by regressive? Well, the idea is this, that when you put an indirect tax, let's say on cigarettes, and then the rich and the poor are paying the same amount of the tax, then this means the tax is regressive. Regressive taxes are those where the taxes are not taking into account people's income. So let's say if a consumer buy a $10 pack of cigarettes, and that consumer is extremely rich and he pays a tax of $1 on it, and at the same time another consumer who has an income of, let's say, only $100 also pays that same tax amount because he buys the same amount of cigarettes or same pack of cigarettes, the tax becomes regressive. So regressive taxes are those where the rich and the poor pay the same amount of the tax, and that is the biggest problem that happens with all indirect taxes. Indirect taxes are regressive in nature. The second thing we want to talk about indirect taxes is the fact that they're also inflationary in nature. Why are they inflationary? And the answer is that they result in what we call cost push inflation. By basically putting indirect taxes, you make the good to be expensive, and that results in the price of the good to go up, and therefore can cause inflation to happen. So indirect taxes are also inflationary in nature. The third disadvantage has to do with the fact that when you look at indirect taxes, we put these indirect taxes on the market where the market previously was operating freely. So indirect taxes do not allow the market to operate freely. We say this, that we make the good expensive, therefore reduce supply, but we also interfere in the market forces of demand supply, and because we do not allow the market to operate freely, there is a possibility of social welfare loss, also called our deadweight loss. So when the government does not allow the market to operate freely, we will have issues of social welfare loss. We saw in the case of indirect taxes, there could be a possibility of deadweight losses. So going back to the diagram, for example, if the government puts a tax on this good, supply curve goes to the left, minimum quantity is Q1, but let's say if this good is not truly a good which has a market failure, then all of this is your deadweight loss. And the reason why this is your deadweight loss is because the government taxes has made it expensive for these consumers to buy the good and these producers to produce the good. So if this good is not truly what we call a demerit good, and you put a tax, for example, you are basically causing social welfare losses. So the third disadvantage that we want to put forward is that indirect taxes do not allow the market to operate freely. The fourth one, when it comes to indirect taxes, is to do with the fact that if we put indirect taxes on demerit goods, then the problem is that the effectiveness of these indirect taxes in terms of lowering the quantity, it may depend on elasticity. Let me explain this point. So if the good is inelastic in nature, we know this, that the price will rise by much more after tax, and the quantity won't fall at all or by very little amount. So if I put a tax on a very inelastic good, let me show you this through diagram. I'm going to make a very inelastic good. Let's say this is demand and supply for a very sort of very habit forming good, and has a very inelastic sort of demand. So it is habit forming good with a very inelastic demand, and government decides to put a tax. So let's say right now this is the supply curve, and price is P naught, quantity is Q naught. Government decides to put a tax like such this one. You can see this, that when you put a tax like S1, the price after tax goes up by much more, from P0 to P1, but the quantity demanded is not falling by that much. So if your goal was to reduce the quantity consumed for this good, your goal isn't really going to be achieved through indirect taxes, because the good is inelastic and people find this good to be habit forming. They may be willing to pay a higher price P1, but they may not cut down quantity. So effectiveness of indirect taxes also depend on how elastic or inelastic the good. Maybe we need to we need to put a very, very large tax to make the quantity go down by a significant amount, but that is a problem that we need to look at. So let's write this: lower the elasticity, higher will be the amount of indirect tax needed to reduce the quantity demanded. Let's now move on to subsidies, and let's look at their pros and cons. So subsidies are put in a case of we say merit goods, and the reason why we want to put subsidies is basically it will make it cheaper for poor consumers to buy the good, and the right quantities will be demanded as a result. So I want to show how subsidies work in the case of our merit goods. So let's say if this is my demand and supply of education, and right now the demand is D naught and the supply is S naught, and the market price is P naught, and government wants to give a subsidy so that ultimately Q1 quantity can be bought. Okay, and that means that they want the quantity demanded to go up. If the demand curve shifts to the right, for example, somewhere like here, let me just show you this. If the demand curve shifts to the right, for example, somewhere like this, then the market price, something like this, then the market price may go up. So government doesn't want that to happen, where it becomes unaffordable for people to buy the good. But if the demand goes up, then the socially desirable quantity will be demanded. What they could do is basically give a subsidy so that the cost of production goes down, something like this. The cost of production goes down, and ultimately Q1 can be demanded. So the government gives a subsidy, like for example like this, where the supply curve shifts to the right, and this amount AB becomes my amount of subsidy. So this amount AB, the amount of subsidy, can result in the market price to go down. So the subsidy results in the price to go down and the quantity demanded to go up. And Q0 minus Q1, which was previously what we call under provision, so Q0 minus Q1, that was the under provision, may not be anymore the under provision, because now the equilibrium price and quantity is happening at Q1. One advantage of subsidy we want to talk about is that because it uses the market force of demand supply, it is easier to execute. So advantage, let's write advantages. So one big advantage is that it uses the market forces of demand and supply. So just by making the good cheaper, we can get ourselves the right quantity, which is socially desirable. The second advantage we want to talk about subsidies is that it is also less costly than direct provision. What do we mean by this? Well, simply that if the government decides to provide the goods themselves, then they may need to undertake production, which might be very expensive as compared to just giving subsidies to the existing producers of the goods. So comparing between direct provision, this the method of subsidy is much more cheaper. Lastly, when you look at subsidies also allow local producers to reduce their cost of production and provides them with more funds available for new investment in production methods as well as product development. So when you look at subsidies provide new fund, or rather more funds to local producers, which could be useful in terms of better products and so on. So local producers. In terms of disadvantages, the first disadvantage we want to discuss about subsidy. Let me write disadvantages. So the first disadvantage that we have of subsidy is that there is an opportunity cost. So opportunity cost it is in terms of more money spent on giving subsidies to, for example, farmers will mean less money available for any other producer or any other sort of expenditure like infrastructures, like for example schools and so on. So there is an opportunity cost attached to it. Also, we would want to know is that when the subsidies are given to producer, they can cause what we say inefficiency, and this inefficiency is where the producer becomes complacent that he is now protected by subsidy, so he doesn't have the urge to reduce the cost of production by himself. Third, the subsidies are also paid out of tax revenue. Therefore, the higher the subsidies, the more the tax burden we are putting on taxpayers. So number 3 is higher tax burden on taxpayers, and this is not good because it may have a disincentive effect on workers. So if you're a worker or producer and you're paying high taxes on profit or on your efforts, you will have a disincentive effect. You may not want to work because the tax burden is going up. Lastly, when the good is inelastic, the government may need to give a large subsidy to get the change in quantity desired. So when the goods are inelastic, the government may need to give a large subsidy to have a desired change in quantity. So this means that if the good is inelastic, the government may require to give much larger subsidy, because the change in quantity demanded will not be much more due to a change in price. So subsidy has to be much larger to see the desired change in quantity, which means it will be more expensive in the case of inelastic good to give a subsidy.